The Dowager Duchess of Fernley arrived at her son's study without knocking, which was how Hugo knew the matter was, in her estimation, already settled. She carried a single sheet of paper, not a letter, but a parish record she had obtained through means she did not disclose, and Hugo did not ask after. She placed it on the desk between them with the care of someone laying down a winning card. "She cannot sign her name," the Dowager said. Hugo looked at the document. It was a baptismal record from the Church of St. Cuthbert's in the parish of Ascot, and beside the entry for Agnes Mary Birch, eldest daughter of Amos Birch, tenant farmer, there was no signature. Only a mark. A small, careful X pressed into the page with what appeared to be considerable concentration. "I see," Hugo said. "You see." His mother remained standing. She wore dove-gray silk and an expression that suggested she had come not to argue, but to conclude. "She is illiterate, Hugo. The woman you intend to make Duchess of Fernley cannot read a menu card. She cannot write an invitation. She cannot manage correspondence with your tenants, your solicitor, your banker. She cannot read the household accounts." "She can manage accounts," Hugo said, still looking at the baptismal record. "She keeps her father's books in her head. 400 acres, 37 tenants, seasonal yields across 6 crop rotations. She told me the figures over dinner, and I had Plowden verify them against our own land records. She was accurate to the bushel." The Dowager's mouth thinned. "That is not the same thing." "No," Hugo agreed. "It is a rather more impressive thing. But I take your point. Then you will reconsider." Hugo lifted the baptismal record and held it toward her. "I will not." Was there anything else? There was not. The Dowager took the document and departed with it, and Hugo sat for some time afterward looking at the place on his desk where it had lain, thinking not of what his mother had said, but of the small, careful X that Agnes Birch had pressed into the parish register, and of the steadiness it must have required to make that mark in a room full of people who could do what she could not. They had met in February, when the river flooded the lower pastures of the Ascot holdings, and Hugo rode out with his steward to survey the damage to his own adjacent lands. Amos Birch was already there, standing thigh-deep in freezing water with 2 of his sons, redirecting the flow with sandbags he had filled since before dawn. His eldest daughter stood on the bank above them calling instructions with the calm authority of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. She was not beautiful in the way London understood beauty. She was brown-haired and strong-shouldered, and her boots were caked to the ankle with river mud. But she turned when Hugo's horse approached, assessed him without deference or alarm, and said, "Your drainage channel is blocked at the eastern culvert. If you clear it before noon, you will save the barley field. After noon, you will not." Hugo cleared it before noon. He saved the barley field. He returned the following week to discuss the drainage with Amos Birch, and found himself instead discussing it with Agnes, who knew more about the water table than his own steward, and who spoke about land with the reverence of someone who understood that soil was not metaphor, but sustenance. He proposed in April, in the Birch kitchen, with flour dust on the table and a pot of something hearty on the stove. Agnes looked at him for a long time before she answered. "You know what I am," she said. "A farmer's daughter. I mean what I cannot do." Hugo understood then that she was not speaking of lineage or rank, but of something more specific, and he waited. "I cannot read," Agnes said. "Not a word, not a letter. My father needed me in the fields, not the schoolroom, and by the time the parish school had a place for the younger ones, I was already keeping the accounts, and there was no one to spare me. I can add a column of figures faster than your banker. I can read weather and soil and a man's intentions from across a room, but I cannot read a book. I cannot write my own name." She said this without apology or shame, as a statement of fact offered to a man who deserved facts before making decisions that could not be undone. "I see," Hugo said, and meant it differently than his mother would later mean it. "If that changes your question," Agnes continued, "I would rather know now than after I have answered it." "It does not change my question." "Then yes." The wedding was held in June, in the chapel at Fernley, and the register was brought forward for signing in the vestry afterward. Hugo signed his name, Hugo Piers Deverell, Duke of Fernley, in the confident hand of a man educated at Eton and Cambridge. Agnes took the pen from the vicar and made her mark, a small X pressed carefully into the page. The vicar wrote Agnes Mary Birch beside it, as was customary. The Dowager, who had seated herself where she could observe the register, said nothing, but Hugo saw her eyes follow the pen, and he saw the expression that settled across her features, like frost across a window. Not anger, but confirmation. The confirmation of a woman who believed she had been proven right and intended to ensure that others knew it. Agnes entered Fernley Park as its new duchess on a warm afternoon in late June. Mrs. Roke, the housekeeper, met her in the entrance hall with a curtsy and a ring of keys and an expression of carefully managed neutrality. The house was vast, 42 rooms across 3 floors, with a servants' wing, 2 libraries, a music room, a gallery, and a conservatory that the late Duke had built for orchids that had since died from inattention. The household accounts are kept in the morning room, Mrs. Roke said, leading Agnes through the corridors with the measured pace of someone who had managed this house for 19 years and intended to manage it for 19 more. Her Grace, the Dowager, preferred to review them monthly. The tradesmen's bills are filed by quarter. I should like to see them, Agnes said. Then, after a pause, so brief that only someone paying close attention would have noticed it. Would you walk me through them? I find I learn a house fastest when someone who knows it well explains its workings. Mrs. Roke glanced at her. It was a careful glance, the kind that a woman who has served the gentry for 2 decades learns to disguise as something else. Whatever she found in Agnes's face, composure, perhaps, or the quiet dignity of someone asking for help without pretending she does not need it, it altered something in the set of her shoulders. Of course, Your Grace, she said, and from that afternoon forward, Mrs. Roke read the accounts aloud each morning while Agnes listened and corrected figures from memory that the ledger had recorded incorrectly. But the accounts were the smallest part of it. Letters arrived daily, invitations, correspondence from solicitors, notes from neighboring estates. The world of a duchess was a world built on paper, and paper was the one terrain Agnes could not navigate alone. Plowden, the steward, a careful man with sandy whiskers and an instinct for discretion, began leaving documents on her desk with small verbal summaries, as though he simply preferred to discuss matters aloud. Mrs. Roke developed a habit of mentioning the contents of invitations in conversation before Agnes could be expected to have read them. The household adjusted around her limitation as quietly and deliberately as water adjusting to stone, and Agnes understood what they were doing and was grateful for it without ever being diminished by it. Hugo said nothing of his intentions. He simply appeared in his study one evening in July after dinner with 2 chairs drawn to the desk and a sheet of paper laid between them. "Sit with me," he said. Agnes stood in the doorway. The candles were lit, 3 branches on the desk, another on the mantelpiece, and the room smelled of ink and leather and the particular warmth of a house in summer. "What are we doing?" she asked. Hugo dipped a pen and wrote a single letter on the page. A. Large and clear, with the serif drawn out in a small flourish. "This is the first letter of your name," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He handed her the pen. She held it as she held most tools, firmly, practically, with the grip of someone accustomed to implements that required strength rather than delicacy. The first A she produced was oversized and trembling slightly at the crossbar. "Again," Hugo said. She wrote it again and again, and by the time the candles had burned down an inch, the page was filled with the letter A in various sizes, the last of them steady and sure, and Hugo said, "Good. Tomorrow we will do G." This was how it began. Every evening, after dinner, after the household had settled into its nocturnal rhythms and the servants had withdrawn, Hugo and Agnes sat together at his desk, and he taught her the alphabet. 1 letter per evening. He did not rush. He did not correct with impatience. He wrote each letter first, then guided her hand through the motion, then watched as she repeated it alone, and if it took 30 attempts before the letter was recognizable, he sat through all 30 without comment except to say again, or better, or there it is. He learned things about her in those evenings that he would not have learned in any drawing room or at any dinner table. He learned that she held the pen too tightly at first, the way she held a hoe or a bridle, and that when she concentrated her lips pressed together and a small crease appeared between her brows that smoothed only when the letter came out right. He learned that she was fiercely impatient with herself, more impatient than he would ever have been, and that when a letter defeated her, she would set the pen down and flex her fingers and stare at the page with the expression of someone who had never in her life permitted a task to remain unfinished. He learned, too, that teaching someone to write is an act of extraordinary intimacy, more intimate than dancing, more revealing than conversation. Because in guiding her hand, he felt the resistance and the yield of her, the moment when effort became ease, and the letter emerged not from instruction, but from understanding. And because she permitted it, permitted him to see her struggle, permitted him to witness the gap between what she could do and what she could not yet do, and that permission was a form of trust more profound than any she had offered at the altar. By the end of July, the alphabet was complete. The letter Z, which Agnes regarded with the suspicion of someone who could not imagine a practical use for it, was nonetheless rendered with the same care as the letter A that had preceded it by 25 evenings. Hugo kept every practice sheet. He did not tell her this, and she did not ask, but Mrs. Roque, who emptied the study grate each morning, noticed that the ashes never contained paper covered in a careful feminine hand, and she drew her own conclusions. By August, she was writing words. Short ones first: cat, dog, sun, rain, field, barn, the vocabulary of the world she knew rendered in the symbols of the world she was entering. Then longer ones, then sentences that Hugo composed for her to copy, and that grew, as the weeks passed, from simple declarations into something more personal. The dog sleeps by the fire. The garden wants rain. I sat in the library today and thought of the river. She copied each one with increasing fluency, and sometimes she would pause and look at what she had written with an expression that Hugo found difficult to name. Not pride exactly, though it contained pride, but something closer to recognition. As though she were meeting a version of herself she had always known existed, but had never been permitted to encounter. One evening in September, she finished a sentence and set the pen down and said, without looking at him, "Why do you do this?" It was not a question so much as an observation requiring a response, and Hugo considered it for longer than the words seemed to warrant. "Because you are my wife," he said, "and because you wish to learn, and because I find I cannot think of a better use for an evening than this." Agnes looked at him then. The candlelight caught the side of her face and threw the other half into soft shadow, and her eyes held something that she did not give voice to, but that settled between them like warmth from the grate, steady, sustaining, and entirely without demand. She was, as Hugo had suspected, formidably quick. The practical intelligence that had allowed her to manage 400 acres from memory translated readily to the page once the symbols were in place. By October, she was reading, haltingly, with her finger tracing beneath the lines, but reading. Hugo brought books from the library and laid them on the desk between them, and they read together in the evenings, his voice filling in when hers faltered, her voice growing steadier each night. The household knew. Mrs. Roque knew, because she saw the ink on Agnes's fingers each morning, and the pages of practice letters tucked into the escritoire in the Duchess's sitting room. Plowden knew, because Agnes began asking him to leave documents rather than summarize them, and because her questions about the estate correspondence grew more specific each week. They said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They simply watched, with the quiet satisfaction of people who understand that dignity comes in many forms and that this was one of them. What the household did not know, what Hugo himself did not learn until later, was that the dowager had not confined her discovery to the single conversation in his study. She had mentioned it. Discreetly, of course. At a card party in the home of Lady Tremaine, she had observed, in the particular tone she reserved for facts she wished to disseminate without appearing to disseminate them, that the new Duchess was a charming girl, really very capable in her way, though one did wonder how she would manage the correspondence, given that she had been raised rather more practically than most. At a luncheon hosted by Mrs. Forsyth, she had gone further, not much further, but enough. "A mark," she had said, lowering her voice, "in the register, where one would normally expect a signature. The ton did not require more than this. Society is a mechanism that runs on implication, and the dowager's implications were precise." Within a month, the new Duchess of Fernley was understood, across 3 counties, to be unable to read or write, and this understanding manifested not in open cruelty. The ton was rarely open about anything, but in the particular texture of social interaction that tells a woman she has been assessed and found wanting. Invitations arrived, written in elaborate hands with unnecessarily complex phrasing. At a dinner hosted by Lady Carmichael, the conversation turned, with the seamless inevitability of something rehearsed, to the subject of novels, and every woman at the table was asked to name her favorite, and when the question reached Agnes, she was watched with the bright attentiveness of people waiting for a stumble. "I have not yet read widely enough to choose," Agnes said, with the composure of someone who understood exactly what was being done and had decided not to permit it to land. "Though I am told your library is exceptional, Lady Carmichael. Perhaps you might recommend a beginning." At a musical the following week, a note was passed to her, an invitation to take a turn at the pianoforte, written in a flowing script on cream card. The woman beside her watched Agnes receive it and watched with particular attention the moment Agnes looked down at the writing, and Agnes felt the weight of that attention like a hand pressing on the back of her neck. She looked at the card for precisely the length of time a literate woman would require to read it, and then she smiled and said, "How kind, but I shall listen this evening," and set the card aside, and the woman beside her learned nothing, and Agnes's hands remained steady in her lap through 3 more sonatas. She did not tell Hugo. Not because she wished to protect him from the knowledge Hugo was a man who sat in the House of Lords and managed an estate of 12,000 acres. He did not require protection, but because telling him would have transformed the matter from something she was enduring into something that required a response, and she was not yet certain what response she wanted. She was accustomed to difficulty. She had managed a farm through drought and flood and a father's declining health. She understood that some things must simply be borne until they pass, and she bore this with the same patience she brought to everything, the patience of a woman who had learned, long before she learned to read, that the world does not rearrange itself to suit the wounded, and that composure in the face of cruelty is not weakness but a choice, made daily at considerable cost. Hugo learned of the Dowager's campaign in November from Plowden, who had heard it from the steward at the Tremaine estate, who had heard it from a footman who had been present when the Dowager first spoke. Plowden delivered the information with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that his employer would want facts, not commentary. Hugo listened. He asked 3 questions: when, to whom, and how Agnes had conducted herself in company since. Plowden answered all 3. The third answer, that the Duchess had attended every engagement, spoken when addressed, and given no one the satisfaction of seeing her falter, settled something in Hugo's expression that Plowden recognized as the particular stillness of a man arriving at a decision he will not revisit. Hugo thanked him and sat alone in his study for the better part of an hour. On the desk before him lay the practice sheet from the previous evening, covered in Agnes's handwriting, steadier now, almost fluent, the letters formed with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for every stroke and won. He looked at it for a long time. Then he didn't go to the Dowager's rooms. He went to Agnes. She was in the morning room, practicing her letters by the light of the tall windows. The afternoon sun came through the glass and lit the page beneath her hand, and she was writing, not copying now, but composing, slowly and with great care, a letter to her father in her own words, in her own hand. Hugo stood in the doorway and watched her write, and something shifted in his chest that he did not attempt to name, because naming it would have required admitting that it had not been there before, or that it had been there all along and he had only now recognized it for what it was. "You know what she has done," he said. Agnes did not look up. "Yes." "You did not tell me." "No." "Why?" Agnes set down the pen and looked at him. Her eyes were the color of autumn. Not the bright theatrical autumn of London parks, but the deep working autumn of fields after harvest, steady and rich and patient. "Because telling you would have made it yours to fix," she said, "and it is not yours to fix, it is mine to outlast." Hugo crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her. He looked at the letter she was writing. "Dear Father, I hope this finds you well. The barley stores should hold through February if the lower barn is sealed properly." The handwriting was clear and growing confident, each letter formed with the careful determination of someone who had earned every stroke. "It is both," Hugo said. "It is yours to outlast and mine to answer." He did not confront his mother. He did not raise his voice or deliver ultimatums or make scenes of the kind that would have given her the satisfaction of believing she had provoked a reaction commensurate with her efforts. Instead, he did something quieter, and to the Dowager, far more devastating. He began bringing Agnes with him. To every dinner, every assembly, every evening gathering in the county, the Duke of Fernley arrived with his wife on his arm and introduced her with the unhurried pride of a man presenting something he valued beyond price. He ensured she was seated beside him at table. He deferred to her judgment on matters of land management in conversations with other landowners, and when she spoke about drainage and crop yields and the management of tenant disputes, the men who listened found themselves confronted with an intelligence so practical and thorough that the question of whether its possessor could parse a Latin epigram seemed suddenly and entirely beside the point. Agnes, for her part, did not perform gratitude for this. She walked beside her husband because that was where she belonged, and she spoke when she had something to say, and she listened when she did not, and she bore the residual whispers with the same composure she had brought to the flooded pastures in February, the composure of a woman who understood that water recedes and that the thing to do while waiting is to keep one's footing. The dowager's design revealed itself on a Tuesday in December. She had arranged a small gathering at the Dower House. 6 women of rank, including Lady Tremaine and Mrs. Forsyth, assembled in the drawing room with tea and a document that the dowager presented as a matter of family business requiring the Duchess's attention. It was a deed of trust relating to a charitable endowment the Fernley estate maintained for the parish school, an endowment that, by tradition, bore the Duchess's signature as patroness. The dowager placed the document on the table before Agnes with an expression of solicitous concern. "I do hope this is not too much trouble," she said. "It simply requires your signature. The trustees are waiting." The 6 women watched. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the December light was thin and gray, and Agnes looked at the document on the table before her and understood precisely what was happening and for whose benefit it had been arranged. She read it. She read every word, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has learned to read not through years of easy immersion, but through months of evening labor, one letter at a time, at a desk beside a man who never once lost patience. The room grew quieter still as it became apparent, to Lady Tremaine first, then to Mrs. Forsyth, then to the others, that the Duchess was not staring blankly at the page but reading it, her eyes moving steadily across the lines, her expression shifting slightly as she absorbed the legal language. "The endowment terms are acceptable," Agnes said. She looked up. "Though the 3rd clause specifies quarterly disbursements, and I believe the parish school would benefit from a provision allowing emergency allocation at the patroness's discretion, I shall ask the Duke's solicitor to amend it." Then she picked up the pen from the inkstand, dipped it, and signed her name. Agnes Mary Deverell, Duchess of Fernley. The letters were clear and firm, each one formed with the steadiness of someone who had practiced that signature 100 times and would practice it 100 more, not because she needed to, but because the act of writing her own name had become a pleasure she did not intend to relinquish. The dowager's face did not change. That was the worst of it, the absolute stillness of a woman who understands in a single moment that the ground beneath her has shifted and that she is now standing on nothing at all. Agnes set the pen down. "There is one more document," she said. She reached into the portfolio she had carried with her. The portfolio the dowager had assumed was an affectation, a prop carried by a woman who could not use its contents, and withdrew a second deed. This one Hugo had drawn up with his solicitor in November, in the weeks after he had learned of his mother's campaign. It transferred a parcel of Fernley land, the 200 acres adjoining the Birch Farm, including the lower pastures that flooded each spring, into Agnes's name alone. "This requires a witness," Agnes said. 2, in fact. She looked around the room. "Lady Tremaine, Mrs. Forsyth, would you be so kind?" They witnessed it. They had no grounds to refuse and no desire to, because what they had just seen had rearranged their understanding of the woman before them, and because refusing the request of a duchess in her own family's house was a social impossibility regardless of the circumstances. Agnes signed the estate deed with the same clear hand, and Lady Tremaine and Mrs. Forsyth signed as witnesses, and the dowager sat in her chair by the fire and watched the document pass from hand to hand and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The winter settled over Fernley. The dowager withdrew, not dramatically, not with the public recriminations that might have restored some measure of narrative control, but quietly, gradually, in the manner of someone whose authority has been not so much challenged as simply superseded. She attended fewer dinners, she received fewer callers. The invitations that had once filled her writing desk each morning thinned to a trickle, and then to nothing, and she sat in the dower house with her silence and her certainty that she had been right, and the certainty kept no better company than the silence. Lady Tremaine, whose instinct for the prevailing wind was as finely calibrated as any barometer, began directing her correspondence to the Duchess rather than the dowager, and the others followed, one by one, until the social architecture of the county had reorganized itself around the woman who could sign her name and not the woman who had wagered she could not. Agnes did not gloat. She did not visit the dower house to display her victory or arrange for the dowager to witness her competence. She simply continued, managing the household with Mrs. Roke, reviewing estate matters with Plowden, writing her weekly letters to her father, reading in the evenings with Hugo. The absence of triumph was, in its way, the most devastating consequence the dowager could have received, because it meant that she had not been defeated so much as rendered irrelevant, and irrelevance is the one condition for which the gentry have no remedy and no consolation. Hugo, when Agnes told him what had happened at the Dower House, sat for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You read the third clause. I read every clause. The emergency allocation provision was your own addition. It was. The school needs it. The roof leaks." Hugo looked at his wife, this woman who had come to him from a flooded field with mud on her boots and the river in her voice, who had married him, knowing what she could not do, and had set about learning it with the same methodical determination she brought to drainage channels and crop rotations and the management of 400 acres from memory. And he understood that what he felt was not pride, though it resembled pride, and not admiration, though it contained admiration, but something less nameable and more enduring. It was the particular devotion of a man who has watched someone become more fully themselves and who knows that he was permitted to sit beside her while it happened. "The roof leaks," he repeated, "badly, since September. Then we shall fix it." They fixed it. They fixed the roof of the parish school, and they fixed the drainage on the lower pastures. And Agnes wrote to her father, in her own hand, in her own words, every week, and Amos Birch kept the letters in a tin box beside his bed, and read them to his younger children on Sunday evenings, and when anyone in the parish asked how his daughter was getting on, he said, "Well, she is getting on well," and he meant it in every sense the word could hold. In the evenings they still sat together at the desk. Not for lessons now. Agnes read fluently by spring, and by summer she was working through the Fernley Library with the systematic appetite of someone making up for lost years, but because the habit had become its own thing, separate from its origin. The way a bridge remains after the river that necessitated it has changed course. They read together, sometimes aloud, sometimes in companionable silence, and sometimes Hugo would look up from his book and find Agnes watching him with an expression that made the candles seem suddenly very bright and the room very warm. Their son was born the following autumn. They named him Amos, after her father, and Hugo's hand shook slightly when he wrote the name in the family Bible. Not from nerves, but from the weight of what the name contained. The joining of a world measured in acres and seasons with a world measured in libraries and lineage, held together by a woman who had learned to navigate both. Agnes wrote the announcement herself. She sat at the desk where she had learned her letters and composed the notice in a hand that was, by then, not merely legible, but beautiful. The beauty of something earned rather than bestowed, each letter carrying within it the memory of the evening it was first attempted, and the patience of the man who had sat beside her while she tried. Amos Birch received the letter at the farm in Ascot on a Wednesday morning. He read it standing in the yard, with the post still in his hand, and the autumn mist rising off the lower pastures, and he read it again, and then he folded it carefully and placed it in the tin box beside his bed, where he kept all of Agnes's letters, a collection that had grown, over the months, from halting sentences into fluent correspondence, charting in ink and paper the journey of a woman from a mark in a register to a name on an estate deed. He came to Fernley for the christening. He wore his best coat and stood in the chapel and watched his daughter hold her son, and when the vicar asked the child's name, it was Agnes who answered, clearly and without hesitation, and Amos's eyes were bright, but his voice was steady when he said afterward to Hugo, in the quiet of the vestibule, "You've done well by her." "She has done well by herself," Hugo said. "I merely held the pen." The study where Hugo had taught her to write became, over the years, the room where Agnes read to their children. She read to them every evening, the same desk, the same candles, the same leather chair that had held her while she formed her first trembling A. Hugo stood sometimes in the doorway and watched her, and the children, there were eventually 3, Amos and then twin daughters, Constance and Ruth, would glance up at him and then return their attention to their mother's voice, which was steady and clear and rich with the authority of a woman who had come to language not as a birthright, but as a choice, and who valued every word precisely because she knew what it had cost. In the desk's top drawer, Hugo kept a single sheet of paper. It was the first full sentence Agnes had ever written from a September evening in the first year of their marriage, copied in a hand that was not yet confident, but was already determined. It read, "I am Agnes, and I am learning. He never told her he had kept it. She never asked, but she knew, because a woman who had taught herself to read the world before she learned to read a page does not fail to notice what a man keeps close and why. The baptismal record from St. Cuthbert's, the one the dowager had carried into Hugo's study with such certainty, the small careful X beside Agnes's name, remained in the parish register where it belonged. Agnes never asked for it to be altered. She did not need it altered. The mark was true. It was who she had been, and she had no quarrel with who she had been, because who she had been was the foundation on which who she had become was built. And foundations are not things to be ashamed of. They are things to be built upon. And in the drawing room at Fernley Park, above the fireplace where the family gathered on winter evenings, Hugo hung a small framed document. It was the estate deed, the one Agnes had signed at the dowager's gathering, in front of 6 witnesses, in a hand that did not tremble. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and Hugo would say only that it was a deed of some personal significance, and Agnes would say nothing at all, and the visitors would move on, and the deed would remain where it was. Proof, if proof were needed, that a name written by one's own hand, learned letter by letter in candlelight, is worth more than any name bestowed by birth. They arrive here, like a name written for the first time in one's own hand, whenever they are ready.